The dinners of scarcity, how the Great Depression changed the American plate. There was a moment in American history when dinner stopped being a meal and became a question that returned every single night with the same weight and the same urgency. What could still be made from whatever was left? During the Great Depression, when work disappeared, when entire local economies collapsed along with banks, farms, and small businesses, millions of families learned that hunger almost never arrived all at once because it moved in slowly, first changing the quality of food, then the quantity, and finally the very idea of what could still be called dinner. That is why this video is not about curious recipes or old-fashioned dishes that simply fell out of style. It is about domestic survival, about kitchens that had to feed many people with almost nothing, about mothers who turned stale bread, dried beans, potatoes, saved fat, and bones with scraps of meat into meals that had no luxury in them, but still served one decisive purpose: keeping the entire household from going to bed hungry. It was in that environment that the dinners in this video were born, or at least hardened into necessity. They were too simple to enter official memory, too humble to earn a place in elegant cookbooks, but far too important to be ignored by any family that had learned in practice that a poor kitchen had to know how to turn very little into enough. So before looking at each of these 15 forgotten dinners, one thing has to be understood first. They did not emerge as charming tradition, and they were not comfort food in the way we use that phrase today. They emerged because the economic crisis changed the American plate from top to bottom, pushed millions of families into a kitchen of restraint, and forced an entire generation to learn that when money disappears, dinner stops being custom and becomes strategy. If this kind of history means something to you, and if you value content that brings back what usually disappears when memory turns into simplification, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because that is how this kind of work keeps finding room to recover what official history almost never places at the center. Number 15, bread and milk. Few dishes explain the kitchen of scarcity as clearly as this one. Bread that had already gone hard, torn or cut into pieces, with milk poured over it to make it chewable again, softer again, and more filling. In many homes, this could appear as a light evening meal, as food for children, or as an immediate solution when there was not enough protein, vegetables, or fat to build anything more elaborate. Simple bread and milk preparations fit the documented domestic patterns of the period, when families had to reuse everything, reduce waste, and stretch basic ingredients as far as possible, especially in rural areas. The dish may sound small today, but what it represented was enormous: the attempt to pull real nourishment out of something that already seemed too far gone to serve. Number 14, potato soup. The potato was valuable because it delivered exactly what a time of crisis demanded: volume, satiety, and flexibility. In a simple soup, it could be cooked until it partly broke down, thickening the liquid on its own, turning water, onion, salt, and perhaps a bit of leftover fat or milk into a meal far more convincing than the individual ingredients would suggest. Home economics publications and food guidance from the 1930s repeatedly emphasized the value of inexpensive, nourishing, high-yield foods, and the potato fit that logic perfectly. In many poor kitchens, potato soup was not a starter. It was dinner itself, especially when served with bread or cornbread. Number 13, soup beans with cornbread. In the South and in Appalachia, few dinners represented food survival more clearly than a pot of beans simmered low and slow with a piece of cornbread on the side. Dried beans were cheap, easy to store, and after hours on the fire, they became something thick, hot, and stable enough to feed many people at once. Cornbread added a cheap and filling companion, gave energy, filled the plate, and helped make use of every spoonful of broth. The central role of dried beans as an economical food appears clearly in official nutrition materials from the period, and records of rural foodways in Kentucky and other inland areas help show how this kind of meal belonged to the daily life of families who needed sturdy, repeatable, inexpensive food. Number 12. Fried potatoes and onions. When the table could no longer count on enough meat, saved fat and potatoes took over. Sliced potatoes, cooked slowly in a skillet until golden at the edges, mixed with soft, sweet onion, were far more than a side dish in poor households. They could be the entire dinner. The strength of this dish was in the transformation. Potatoes alone were cheap. Onion deepened the flavor, and reused fat, often pork fat, added aroma, calories, and the sense that there was real substance on the plate. Records of domestic and rural eating in the period show exactly this dependence on basic ingredients and total reuse, where nothing with caloric value was wasted. The result was a simple, heavy, effective dish built to hold the night together. Number 11. Bean soup in its most essential form. In the end, perhaps no dinner represents the Great Depression more fully than a pot of beans cooked in water with onion, perhaps a bay leaf, perhaps a leftover bone or a scrap of salted meat, until the beans thickened the broth and turned very little into enough. The economic and nutritional importance of dried beans needs no romantic invention. Federal home economics materials from the early 1930s treated dried beans and peas as especially useful foods when other supplies were limited, precisely because they were inexpensive, abundant, and valuable from a nutritional standpoint. In narrative terms, bean soup is almost the complete image of the era because it gathers everything the crisis demanded from the kitchen: patience, yield, reuse, warmth, and the discipline of feeding an entire household with almost nothing but a pot and time. Number 10. Split pea soup with ham bone. This is one of those dishes that shows with almost cruel clarity how the kitchen of poverty worked. Split peas were cheap, dry, easy to store, and when cooked long enough, they thickened on their own without cream, butter, or any other luxury. The ham bone entered the pot to bring depth, salt, and the impression that there was more meat there than there actually was. In practical terms, it was exactly the kind of meal a struggling household needed: a large, cheap, hot, dependable pot that could feed several people with the help of bread or cornbread. The logic of this dish fits directly into the utilitarian food model that took hold during the Depression, when the household kitchen was forced to extract the maximum amount of nutrition and satiety from modest ingredients. Number 9. Salt, pork, and beans. Few combinations capture the economy of survival as clearly as dried beans and a small piece of cured pork. The beans supplied volume, protein, and yield. The salted meat, even in a small quantity, spread flavor through the entire pot and made dinner feel more complete. This kind of preparation made sense precisely because a family did not need much meat to feel its presence on the plate. A small piece was enough to transform an entire meal. Home economics materials from the period treated dried beans and peas as central foods in times of hardship, and historical documentation of regional foodways shows the importance of slow, inexpensive dishes like this in the daily life of poor households, especially in the South and in rural areas. Number 8. Black-eyed peas with ham hock. In many Southern kitchens, this was the perfect formula for well-managed scarcity. Black-eyed peas cooked relatively quickly, stored well, and yielded a great deal, while the ham hock, even though it was a cheap and humble cut of pork, released enough fat, collagen, and flavor to give the entire broth body, the result was a dark, salty meal rich with the feeling of sustenance, the kind that did not depend on abundance to feel like real food. The historical value of this dish also lies in the way it connects the Depression directly to older regional traditions, preserved and observed by the writers of the America Eats Project, who documented how local foodways survived even under extreme economic pressure. And before we continue, if this kind of historical memory means something to you, take a moment to follow the channel, because this kind of content only stays alive while there are still people who care enough to remember what almost everyone else chose to forget. Number 7. Collard greens with pot liquor and cornbread. Today, many people look at a plate of cooked greens and imagine a side dish. But during the Great Depression, in many Southern homes, this could be dinner itself. Greens such as collards, mustard greens, or turnip greens, cooked slowly with a small amount of cured pork, produced something valuable not only for the greens themselves, but also for the dark, salty liquid left in the bottom of the pot. That broth, known in many regions as pot liquor, carried flavor, minerals, and the feeling that there was real substance on the table, especially when crumbled cornbread was stirred into it. What makes this dish so important is not only its simplicity, but the fact that it shows how poor families could turn hearty vegetables and a minimum amount of fat into a functional, regional meal deeply tied to the land. Number 6, succotash. Before it became an occasional side dish on nostalgic menus, succotash was in many contexts a practical survival food. Corn and beans or lima beans brought together in the same pot provided volume, energy, and a certain nutritional density, especially when a little fat or salted meat could be added for flavor. The dish had roots that long predated the Great Depression, but that very age was part of what made it useful in hard times, because it already belonged to an American repertoire of economical, rural, adaptable cooking. In a decade when household food was pushed toward increasingly utilitarian forms, dishes like this stayed alive not because of prestige, but because they worked. They filled the pot, sustained the family, and fit within the limits of a household that had to count every ingredient. Number 5, macaroni and tomatoes. This dish occupied an important place because it solved two problems at once. It was cheap, and it felt more substantial than it actually cost. The macaroni stretched, the tomatoes added acidity, color, and the impression that there was enough sauce to justify an entire dinner, even when there was no meat at all in the pot. In many southern and rural kitchens, that combination fit perfectly into Depression logic because it used accessible ingredients that were easy to store and easy to repeat. The result was not a refined dish, but a hot, filling, familiar meal, the kind that could occupy the table with dignity even when the pantry was slipping into the emptiest part of the month. Number 4, tomato gravy over biscuits. This is one of the dishes that best reveals the intelligence of the poor American kitchen. With a little fat, flour, and tomato, it was possible to make a thick, hot gravy full of presence, capable of turning plain biscuits into a complete meal. The power of this preparation lay precisely in the practical illusion it created, because very few things seem to stretch as far as a well-made gravy poured over fresh or reheated bread. The tomato brought brightness and depth, the flour gave body, and the biscuits absorbed everything, turning a minimal set of ingredients into something convincing and comforting. For households that needed food to look larger than it really was, this was not a regional detail. It was domestic strategy. Number 3, creamed chipped beef on toast. Even though many people associate this dish with the military or with later decades, The logic behind it speaks directly to the kitchen of scarcity. Preserved meat in a small amount, white sauce to multiply volume, and bread as the base of support. In difficult times, meals like this made sense because they extracted the maximum amount of flavor and presence from small portions of protein, spreading the feeling of abundance where there was actually restraint. The bread absorbed the sauce carried the salt and force of the cured meat, and the entire combination produced a dinner that felt more robust than its components suggested. It is exactly this kind of culinary ingenuity, repeated across so many American households, that helps explain why dishes like this survived so long in popular memory. Number 2, liver and onions. No dish exposes the difference between the kitchen of necessity and the kitchen of comfort as clearly as this one. Liver was cheap, nourishing, accessible, and much more common in the everyday diet of poor families than people today often imagine. When cooked with onions, it gained sweetness, moisture, and an extra layer of flavor that helped make it more acceptable, especially for children and for anyone who had to eat it not out of preference, but out of economic obligation. During the Great Depression, when every purchase had to justify its value, nutritionally dense foods mattered enormously, and liver fit exactly into that place. The fact that it has nearly disappeared from the modern table does not reduce its importance. It only shows how food memory tends to erase whatever reminds people of a time when eating was, above all else, a matter of endurance. Number 1. Bean soup as the total meal of survival. At the top of this list is not the most complex dish, not the most regional one, and not the one most fondly remembered by people looking back with nostalgia. It is the dish that may have done more than any other to keep families fed when almost everything else was failing. Dried beans, water, onion, perhaps a bone, perhaps a scrap of cured pork, perhaps only salt and thyme. And still, from that came a meal capable of carrying an entire household. Bean soup concentrated everything the Great Depression demanded from the American kitchen: patience, discipline, economy, repetition, and the ability to turn almost nothing into something that could truly sustain. It could change in name, bean type, seasoning, and thickness depending on the region, but its function remained the same everywhere poverty tightened its grip. Feed many, last more than one meal, and keep hunger from advancing to the point of despair. If there is one dinner that deserves to be remembered as the symbol of domestic survival in the Great Depression, it is this one, because it was not the exception. It was the routine, and precisely because it was so common, so useful, and so absolutely necessary, it was pushed out of the comfortable memory of a country that preferred to forget how much it depended on it. These dishes were not tradition. They were the last barrier against misery, collapse, and total chaos. What makes this list so heavy is not only the simplicity of these dishes, but what they actually meant. For millions of families during the Great Depression, these meals functioned as the last barrier between a household still standing and a household completely defeated by want. At the beginning of 1933, about 13.5 million people were unemployed, and more than a quarter of the American workforce had no work at all. And hunger almost never arrived all at once. It advanced in stages. In July 1933, roughly 15 million people in the United States depended on public assistance. And by July 1934, that number had already reached around 17 million. At the beginning of 1933, there were 3,859,000 families receiving public assistance. When a country has to sustain millions of families through direct aid, dinner stops being routine and becomes damage control. That is the point where bean soup, potatoes with onions, and bread with milk, stop looking like modest dishes and begin to reveal what they really were: domestic mechanisms of survival. The most shocking part is that much of this fragility already existed before the full collapse. In 1929, nearly 80% of American families lived on annual incomes of $3,000 or less. More than 42% survived on $1,500 or less, and 5.75 million families had yearly incomes below $1,000. When the economy crashed, millions of households already living at the edge lost the little that was still holding the home together. That is why these dishes carry a weight that goes far beyond culinary memory. They were not just simple food, they were the cheapest and most reliable way to keep a family functioning when almost everything else had already failed. And that setting becomes even more brutal when one remembers that between 1930 and 1933, about 9,000 banks suspended operations, taking with them the savings of families who were already living without any margin for error. In the end, these 15 dinners do not only tell the story of forgotten dishes. They reveal the anatomy of a society in crisis, where the evening meal could be the difference between a household still organized and a household surrendered to misery, collapse, and total chaos. These dishes did not promise comfort or abundance. They promised only continuity. And for those living pressed against the last barrier, continuity was everything. And if any part of this story reminded you of something passed down in your family, an old memory, a custom you heard about from your grandparents, or even a hard situation that left a mark on your home, write it in the comments. I want to know what you remember, which dish stayed in your family's memory, and what story about difficult times is still alive with you today.